So much better. So much better at Zoom than we all were, you know, however long ago it was. All right, I'm gonna make this full screen so it looks nice. Okay, here's what we're going to cover today. First step, this is what I always say when I initiate a project like this. The first step is figuring out what you have and where it is. We're also going to talk about some of the basics of preserving both physical and digital audio media. Maintenance, so important, easy to overlook. And then I will hand off to Nikki to talk about creating access and sharing content. And what we hope you will take away today, some strategies for organizing and inventorying your content, some resources for digitizing in-house or working with a digitization vendor. I will give you a big old reality check because preservation costs money, it takes a long time, and it doesn't end with digitization. It does require constant ongoing maintenance. And then again, we'll share some ideas for uncovering value in your collection and sharing content and creating access. First, a massive congratulations to the Kitchen Sisters for their partnership with the Library of Congress. It's wholly deserved, and we're all just thrilled that their recordings and interviews and field recordings and ambience and everything they've collected over their years as producers will have a permanent home at the Library of Congress. So congratulations to the Kitchen Sisters. Of course, that partnership would not have been possible if we didn't put some work in at the beginning to figure out what was in those boxes and what was on those hard drives. There you go. So this is my how it started, how it's going meme attempt. In September of 2019, I went to the Kitchen Sisters offices and we started looking at the stuff, the tangible media, to figure out how we could create an inventory and figure out what they have. And this is actually a very poor example because most of the stuff in the offices was very well organized in beautiful labeled boxes. But as you can see, you know, a mere 2.5 years later, the Library of Congress has acquired this collection. So how did we get from there to here? It was a lot of work. I'm not gonna, not gonna lie about that one. So another lovely picture of the Kitchen Sisters in the early 1980s. One thing we figured as we started going through those boxes was that when you have a career that spans 40 years of audio recording, you will cover pretty much every format that existed in those 40 years that you can record on. And that means we had a lot of DATs, a lot of digital audio tapes, a lot of cassettes, but also some micro cassettes and mini discs and zip discs and 1/4-inch reel-to-reel tape. And we had to figure out what to do with all of that. Our first step in this process was a big picture step. What do they have? How do we prioritize it? We needed the raw numbers. So to get the raw numbers, we went into the offices and got our hands dirty. Find some space, pull down the boxes, open them up, take a look, start counting. We needed to figure out what we had in terms of audio recordings, video, hard drives. We also had correspondence and photographs and research and notebooks, and think about all of the other things you may have that are an important part of your collection. In this case, we were dealing with, as I said, over 40 years of recorded material. And we had to figure out how to prioritize that stuff and how to make sense of it. It's easy to look at it and become very overwhelmed. In this case, thank you, Kitchen Sisters. This was mostly very neatly organized in boxes. They had organized things by story and by series. And that was important to me to understand organically how they had gathered this material and grouped it. It may be different for you. I feel like that's an important part of the conversation you have when you start a project like this. Sometimes people will organize things by format or by date chronologically or by some other grouping, but you need to get a sense of what's important to the people you're working with in that collection, right? You need to do a little digging because I will tell you, more stuff always shows up. There's always another box somewhere. So engaging in conversation helped us uncover things like, oh, Nikki had some boxes at her house, and Davia had some reel-to-reel tapes at her house, and things just began to emerge from the nooks and crannies of the Kitchen Sisters, and we found so much wonderful material. We were able to complete a really accurate inventory that started with us getting eyes on the stuff. So the next part of this was to triage. Get all the stuff together, look at it. As I said, you might want to organize by project or by date or by format or by some other means, but the key there is to be consistent. Then we created an inventory. And I know that those of you who may work at universities may have access to much more sophisticated databases or FileMaker systems or things like that. And if you have access to that, by all means, go that way. But for this project, we didn't have access to a database programmer. We were kind of fulfilling that role. So we needed to create an inventory using a spreadsheet that followed best practices, that used a standardized language, and that was useful for our project and for our needs, and was collaborative. We did this using Google Sheets. Really, really simple, shareable tool, right? But again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel because other people have already figured this stuff out and developed these standards and these best practices. We used an open source template, courtesy of the very fine folks at a company called We Are AVP. And this tool is called the AVCC. It's an audio visual cataloging tool. It's collaborative, and it gives you things like the standardized language for referring to one of these. Because if I hold this up to you, some of you might say, oh, that's a tape, or it's a cassette, or it's a compact cassette, or it's an audio cassette. And if you are trying to keep track of 3,000 of these, and sometimes you call it a tape and sometimes you call it an audio cassette, ultimately that's not very useful. So what we did was create drop-down menus. I know I sound like a big spreadsheet nerd here, but it was a really basic way to incorporate a controlled vocabulary in a drop-down menu. So every time I came across one of these, I could go to column E and drop down and call it an audio cassette. And that means every time we had an instance of that, it was easy to actually document what it was that we were, to keep the language consistent, right? There was a lot more that went into the spreadsheet, and we can certainly talk more about getting into the details. I can take a pause for a moment and see if there are any questions in the chat or anything. I know Summer says spreadsheets make the world go round, and it's so true. And thank you, David, for putting We Are AVP in the chat. It's a really great resource, and they have a lot of open source tools that I use and that you can all incorporate into your archiving practices. Do we have, any
There is
questions?
a question. I see a question about the difference between a commercial and non-commercial cassette from Lynette.
Ah, that is a good one. We actually had a category in this spreadsheet to distinguish between a commercial cassette, which would have had a copyright, and something more like this. So how granular you get is somewhat up to you and the needs of your archive. In this case, it was important for us to distinguish copyrighted material from non-copyrighted material, but with a spreadsheet, it's always easier to put things back together than to take things apart. So we would use a separate column to distinguish, is this a commercial recording or like an interview tape? So that is a good question. We went fairly granular. I think we had we were into the AABBCC section of the Google Sheets columns. So that's how much data we were collecting throughout this process. Any other questions? It's hard to keep track of the chat because there are so many of you here, but you can toss your questions in the chat, and then we'll make space to keep talking about all this. So another challenge here was throughout their years, the Kitchen Sisters had some really great documentation. They had spreadsheets in existence, but they weren't always consistent. So sometimes they had a different numbering system or a different way of naming the things or even a different way of formatting the date. Now, if I were a database programmer, I'm sure I would have some brilliant way of putting all of these things together and creating some magnificent, clean database documenting everything. But I am not a database programmer.
Yeah.
Most of you, I'm guessing, are not database programmers.
I'm not sure it applies to me. They're talking about.
So again, we're doing the best we can with what we've got while still trying to align with best practices. And in this case, we just created a column in our spreadsheet to keep track of previous IDs as we implemented a new consistent numbering system. So speaking of numbering systems, I love throwing out this language. We needed a unique identifier for each physical object. So every single one of these, I feel like Vanna White with my one object. Every single one of these got a unique ID, and we put a sticker on it. And we came up with a system to number everything so that this can be connected to all of its digital files. So again, I just want to reinforce that we're not thinking of this as cataloging, leave that to the experts, but we're creating an inventory. And the key here is that everything we do should be useful to future us or to whoever is going to get this stuff next. The other part of the spreadsheet that was so crucial was to use a controlled vocabulary. Because again, if you're trying to run a search and figure out how many of a particular media type you have to be consistent and use standardized language. But again, we're not reinventing the wheel. We don't have to make this up. The very fine people at PB Core provided us with a physical audio vocabulary. So I want to throw that out there as another resource. PB Core is based on public broadcasting. So for those of you in radio, incredibly useful. We used it not only to describe our media types, but also to create drop-down menus to document, is this a broadcast master or an edited tape or raw interview? I was going to say footage, but it's not footage when it's audio. What do we call it when it's audio, not footage?
We call it tape.
Call it tape, right? Raw tape. So that kind of language became really useful in keeping us consistent in documenting whatever it was that we had in our hands and creating something that was going to be useful moving forward. So again, PB Core, a ton of great information there. It's a cataloging standard for description of audiovisual content and will be incredibly useful, especially to those of you working in radio. So here it is in practice. I know it's hard to see on Zoom, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to actually click through and give you a full demo of it. But this is the spreadsheet template. It's most of it. There's probably 15 more columns that we didn't capture in this picture. But it enabled us to work collaboratively, to create an accurate inventory, to sort by format or series or by story, and to flag high priority items.
Jessica?
Yeah.
There's a question about combining these sheets because, as you mentioned, there have been many of them in the past years that people have created. Like, this is one of the things that happened with us. We've created many different versions. Is there a way to, combine this material?
There are really sophisticated ways that are beyond my skill set and possibly beyond the skill set of many people on this Zoom. So what we did, I know it's really hard to see, but in the purple right here at the beginning and the blue, the first 4 columns all refer to our new numbering system and all the previous numbering systems that you had used. And that was one way for us to keep track of something that existed in a previous spreadsheet where we could pull some of that data into this one while still sticking with our new consistent numbering system. So I hope that answers one thing. There's a way to keep track of these things while still kind of imposing a new consistent system on top of it.
Another question. So you mentioned that there are ways, and I know we can look this up in your resources, but do you have a recommendation for how you should do dates and, just some of those basic things you should and shouldn't do when you're naming either files or whatever?
Yes, absolutely. There are standardized ways of using dates. And fortunately, the Google Slides or Google Spreadsheets kind of helps do that for you, and it can be translated into a numeric date. So for example, if we were using today's date, we might say 2/8/22. We might say 8/2/22 or 2022 02/08. What, there are lots of different ways of doing it. You have to go to something like the Library of Congress standards and figure out the best practice and standardized way of implementing a date. And then one thing that came up a lot was one single cassette might have been used to record over 2 or 3 days. Or we might just have a year or a month and a year and no date. So for that, I'm not going to spout off the best practices off the top of my head for fear of not getting them exactly right. But that stuff does exist. And you can go to places like the Library of Congress Controlled Vocabularies or PB Core or AVCC. Those are all great resources for giving you the guidance on how to do something like put in a date, which again, it sounds like it should be so straightforward, and yet it can get very quickly very complicated. How are we doing? Do we have other questions? I'm trying to keep track of.
Here's one. Can you talk about how you handle J cards and other inserts with audio, or handled? I don't know what that is even. So there you go.
Well, you can scan them or you can photograph them. And I will say that this would not be considered like a best practice per the Library of Congress, but as an intermediary step, we did take photographs of our items and tag them with the unique ID so that we could have a way of connecting, a picture of this thing with the digital audio file that came from this cassette. So scanning and then utilizing the same unique ID is a great way to document any sort of paper materials that come along with the audio material.
So Alice is curious about linking the spreadsheet to the digital file itself.
Oh, that's a good one. This is one of those things where I think when you work at a larger institution, there are ways of doing this that are beyond the capability of most folks who would just be an independent producer. But one thing I have done, we didn't actually do this with the Kitchen Sisters project, but one thing I have done is drop a link in the spreadsheet to where the audio file exists in the cloud. That gets a little farther along into like cloud storage. But that was one way of just connecting, oh, hey, here's the document of this record. Here's a link that will take you to the audio file. Any other questions, or shall we?
Yes, there's one more here.
Okay.
Did you copy them into a current format? And if so, what did you do with the old recording?
Oh, okay. So that's a great segue into our whole next section, because the next session we are going to talk about the digitizing process. So I'll dive into that. Preservation through digitization. We did copy many of them, or we format or digitize many of them. There are so many in this collection that it would take much, much longer than we've had to digitize them all, but we're working on it. And for all of your projects, that's the next hurdle, right? You have to figure out how to get this stuff digitized. So we'll take a few minutes to talk about this stuff. And again, we love making this collaborative and keeping it useful to all of you. So if you do have questions, you can throw them in the chat, and I will thank the rest of the Kitchen Sisters team for helping me field the questions. But we'll go over some basics of audio digitization, best practices and standards. We can talk a little bit about why you might choose to do this in-house versus outsourcing to a vendor. And then figuring out how to develop a workflow that's efficient, effective, adheres to best practices, and aligns with the resources that you have. So our goal here through digitization was to create a preservation copy. And that was by digitizing or reformatting the many, many, many audio recordings in this collection. As you can see from the picture here, we would take a box of cassettes and transform them into 40 broadcast WAV files digitized in real time at the current Library of Congress best practices and standards. And where we're at now, we have many, many folders on our Kitchen Sisters collection hard drive that have broadcast WAV files. We created access MP3s, and we also have a collection of JPEGs documenting the physical items themselves. So here's a tip for you. Some formats are easier than others. So throughout this process, consider what you can do and what you might need to send out. Don't let yourself get bogged down by the ones that are difficult. For the analog media in your collection, I was a little surprised that many of you responded that you had open reel tapes in your collection. And of course, a lot of cassettes. And by discs, I mean, your LPs or your 78s. The current best practices recommend digitizing at 96 kilohertz, 24 bits. It's a broadcast WAV file. If that's confusing to you already, you may consider hiring someone to help you with this process or outsourcing to a vendor. If I start throwing technical terms at you and that kind of sends you into the weeds, that's sort of a sign that maybe that's not not an area that you should take on yourself. However, I know how many radio folks we have here, so I know that many of you that is incredibly familiar and you would be able to dive right in and start digitizing. The biggest challenge these days is sourcing quality playback machines, and we'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but also the challenge of finding machines that are well calibrated and well maintained and that will actually give you the best rendering of that analog data as you transfer it to a digital format. For the digital media, the dream of the 90s, right? How many of you have that? Many discs? I know a lot of CDRs. I know a lot of you are sitting on just spools of CDRs, unlabeled or like loosely labeled, right? This requires preservation through reformatting. You're basically taking the ones and zeros on a digital audio tape and transferring them to a broadcast WAV file. The challenge, once again, sourcing quality playback machines and keeping them in good working order. I mean, who has a CDR or DVD drive that connects to their computers anymore? I'm guessing very, very few of them. Very, very, very few of you. There are a lot of tips and tricks here. With DATs, for example, sometimes they will play back beautifully in one machine and not at all in another, or really glitchy in another. The only advice I have for you there is what I always say, you hit play and you pray. And if it doesn't work in that machine, you try another. Sometimes what we call linear media, like DATs and going back to the analog stuff, the cassettes needs to be exercised. What is that? You have to play it all the way through, fast forward all the way through to the end, rewind all the way to the beginning, and then hit play, and then you might get a better playback. Sometimes when a digital playback fails, you go analog. For example, if you have a CD and you're trying to rip it and it's not working, it's all glitchy or it's just not reading, sometimes you actually have to play it back on a CD player and record in real time, and that will get you the data that you need to get. I'm throwing out a lot of sort of tips and tricks or things you might encounter just to give you a broad sense of what you're dealing with when you take on a preservation project like this. So Born Digital, I will admit to you, is not totally in my wheelhouse because I'm kind of an analog gal, as you can see. But I wanted to show you this picture of the cabling that was required to plug in one hard drive, because I felt like that was a really good visual cue that just to plug in a hard drive, just to migrate some data from one rather old hard drive to a new hard drive, I had to dig out like 6 cables. So I'm recognizing the Sisyphean task here. I know that many of you have perhaps decades of work on hard drives, labeled consistently, inconsistently, and you have to figure out how to migrate it to a new drive. That's the main task here. labeling everything, again, finding a consistent way of naming your files, finding a consistent folder hierarchy structure, moving it to a new drive every so often, backing it all up. And kind of a big picture thing to think about here is you just have to develop a system that you can use consistently and that you can use moving forward as a gift to your future self. I'll take a moment for some questions here because I'm trying to keep track of some that are coming through. Oh, so for DATs, for digital audio tapes that are either at 44.1K or 48K, the best practice currently is if you are migrating them digitally, then your preservation file will be whatever the digital source file was. So if it's a 44K DAT, you will send those ones and zeros to your computer and you will have a 44K WAV file at the end of that. What other questions do we have here?
Julie Rogers asks, what can today's producers do to best prepare their digital tape for preservation? And I think you're kind of answering those questions, but what can we do starting looking forward? How can we deal with our digital tape for the future?
Oh, that's such a good question. I will say that if you're talking about digital audio tapes, like DAT tapes, they are among the most precarious media formats we have right now, and they are more and more difficult to migrate. So I would actually prioritize DAT tapes over something like reel-to-reel tape in some cases. You know, reel-to-reel tape from the 50s holds up remarkably well. Digital audio tapes, CDRs, not so much. So one, prioritize those for reformatting. I will talk a little bit about some tips and tricks for file naming and folder hierarchies, and that might help. I'm looking at questions on my phone too here. Any other questions before we continue? Oh, here's a good question. How we are delivering the Kitchen Sisters collection to the Library of Congress, digital or analog? Would one of you, Nikki or Davia, you want to answer that?
Both. They're getting our actual cassettes and all of our tapes, our real material, and we're giving them all of the things that have been born digital on a hard drive, and all of the things that we are digitizing now on a hard drive. We're rounding up all of the stories we've ever done and putting those on a hard drive, or we're trying to round them up. It's not easy. You know, it seems like it should be easy, but it's not. And it takes time. But actually, it's very satisfying. I say just start anywhere and just be consistent, develop a system, and try to stick to it.
That's good advice. And that also answers a bigger question. Yes, we almost always keep the physical item. And I know that storage can become problematic. We can talk about that in a moment. But although audio technology has really come to an amazing place where the digitized files, they can sound remarkably accurate. They can sound as, you know, we can make things sound as though you were in the room when it was recorded. But there's still, I think among audio engineers, there's still this thought of like, we might have a better way of doing this in the future. Or hard drives crash, files become corrupt. So, you know, that I think the archivist within all of us would say, hold on to these things if you can, as a fail-safe, as a backup. I got another question about reel-to-reel tapes that become sticky, and that is, again, a huge problem, mostly with reel-to-reel tapes from the 70s moving on. And for those, they frequently need to be baked. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but it's true. We put them in convection ovens or food dehydrators and bake them for a period of time at a very, very low temperature. And that helps the chemicals readhere. I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds there, but it helps them readhere so you can get a solid playback. but they can be very precarious. And if you play back a sticky tape without baking, you risk completely pulling off all of that magnetic material that contains your audio, or destroying the tape, or honestly damaging your tape machine as well. I'm looking through some other questions here. Mini discs. Man, I haven't done mini discs in a while. Again, this is such a common challenge, but finding a quality mini disc player that will actually play back your mini disc is really the big hurdle there. And to be honest, I don't have one in my studio. Last time I had to deal with mini discs, I had to call up a friend and take them over to his studio. Same with mini cassettes. You just have to find a player that works, and the cabling can get a little complicated with something like that. So again, that's something where it's like you often need to find or have made a special cable that will go from a mini cassette player that you can get into the system that will take it into your computer. And for sure, I've had old digital files that were difficult to open. I think anyone who was working in early digital audio with early digital audio workstation probably still has some SD2 files. They are not easy to open. I did a little experiment a year or two ago where I took a very old hard drive and tried to recover my first ever Pro Tools editing session from when I was in school. And I was unsuccessful. I was not able to recover that session, so we'll never hear Jessica's first audio production 101 project. There are folks who purposefully keep very old computers running very old digital audio workstations around their studios for this exact thing. And certainly many of the larger vendors who deal with audio video migration will have ancient computers and early digital audio workstations in order to help you open those digital files from, you know, the 90s or the early 2000s. All right. Any other big questions, or should we see what's next? You know what's next. Little file naming for you. So once again, we are not reinventing the wheel here. Best practices already exist. And for example, here I went to the Recording Academy's technical guidelines. Their producers and engineers wing has published some really thorough and well-researched and implementable guides for things like how to name a file. Is that something that you all spend a lot of time thinking about? Once again, the key here is just to be consistent. They recommend you keep them short. You don't need to label a file. Sorry. You don't need to label a file with like all of the information pertaining to that file, because you should already have some sort of inventory that you could refer to. So keep your file names short, no special characters. We avoid periods, slashes, and spaces, and instead we use capitals and underscores. So here's my example: consistency is key, .wave. And once again, there's your resource. They also have guidelines for folder hierarchies. Folder hierarchies, here's my hot tip for this one, because this is something I use in my work all the time. I keep a template of empty labeled folders on the base level of my work hard drive. And it has a, like, as I said, it's like the folder hierarchies are already there, but all the folders are empty. And every time I get a new project, I can just copy all those empty labeled folders into my new project, and they are already there waiting for audio files to populate them. So coming up with a template and then keeping it on, you know, the root level of your hard drive can be a really easy way to just implement best practices in folder hierarchies. And for a lot of details on that, you know, it's got to be specific to your project. So I can't really tell you what you should, or how you should label your folders, but the Recording Academy guidelines can be really helpful there. Let's see. I had to pull in at least one meme, right? Because I'm guessing that many of you, especially those of you who lived through the age of CDRs or the early days of digital, when we were not always so diligent about labeling our files, have folders on your hard drives that look like this. Again, you know, none of this is useful unless you implement it consistently, and you are looking backward and you are looking forward. So hopefully one thing you can take away from today is just getting a sense of the importance of a consistent file naming structure and then using that moving forward. So future you and whoever inherits your wonderful audio collections will know what the stuff is and where it is. We kept track of this in our spreadsheet. For example, you can see in this light green section here, we wrote down what the file name was for these items that we were digitizing. We also were able to document the date things were reformatted, who worked on it, some notes. For example, as you can see, LF0037 got flagged for review because the end of the DAT was glitchy and we needed to transfer a safety DAT. Again, none of this stuff is useful if you don't document what you're doing, so you can actually keep track of what you've done, where it is. I love talking about gear, and it's hard to gauge a Zoom audience like this, but I thought I would just take a moment. Some of this is a reality check, and then some of it is potentially useful for those of you who might set up a digitizing workstation within your studios or within your offices. So the simplest setup here for digitizing your tangible media is that you need some machine to play back the stuff, and you need something to convert the analog into digital, and you need some sort of digital audio workstation on your computer. And this is what I used for much of the Kitchen Sisters collection. I have in my studio a couple of cassette decks, but here's a Tascam 122MK3, very popular in radio stations and in preservation studios. And hey, I got it for free. It didn't work, so I had to pay $350 to get that repaired, but it was still a good deal. I use the Metric Halo interface. It costs about $3,000. If that sounds like a lot, there are less expensive options. If it doesn't sound like a lot, there are much, much, much more expensive options. You can literally spend a few $100s or many tens of thousands of dollars to set up a system for digitizing this stuff. I was working in Pro Tools. Again, it's a yearly subscription, but don't forget you also need a computer and cables and headphones and speakers and a lot of other little things that come along with this. So again, this is another one of those moments. If this already sounds like overwhelming or confusing, this might be a good opportunity to consider partnering with an outside vendor. Here's where I get to get on a soapbox a little bit, because with digitizing, obviously this is my profession. This is what I do every day. And I have experienced firsthand the difference that one tape, I'm going to use this tape throughout the whole thing, the difference that this a digitized version can sound when you do it on a well-calibrated, well-maintained cassette deck or one that's not so well-maintained. Like, you can hear the difference, and it's very dramatic. The range of quality that you can get from a poorly maintained or poorly calibrated playback machine or one that's in tip-top shape. So I wanted to throw out some language that I thought would be useful to those of you who might be doing your own digitizing, because this is the stuff that comes up when I'm doing my work and I know it's not going well. Some of the issues you may have when you are digitizing analog media. You may get speed problems. So a cassette deck or a reel-to-reel machine that's not in great condition may play back quite slow or quite fast or inconsistent or very wobbly. And that's going to give you an inaccurate representation of your audio. It's, you don't want to do it that way. Don't do it wrong. Don't put all the effort into it and have a subpar digital version of your analog media. I'll just throw out some other terms and then we can pause for some more questions. So azimuth, this is, to put it very simply, the alignment of the tape heads. It's adjustable on some decks, but a misaligned azimuth can give you a recording that sounds weird, often very dull or phasey or fuzzy or hazy. If things were recorded on a misaligned deck in the first place, it is your job to compensate for that on playback. And that is not always a straightforward adjustment. So just something to be aware of. Phasiness can come from a misaligned azimuth, or can't tell you how often this happens. At some point in the lifespan of this media, cables were swapped, and you get things that sound washy or fuzzy or unintelligible. And again, it's your job when you're doing the digitizing to recognize what's going on and compensate for it. Left-right balance, you get things that make it, you feel like you're listening, sort of tipped over. Poorly calibrated machines will often play back at totally inaccurate levels on one or both channels. That also accounts for a tape that was recorded at a very, very low volume or loudness, and you may need to compensate for that when you're doing the digitizing. And then finally, wow and flutter, that's again some irregularities in playback that can give you fluctuations and wobbles and warbles. And those are all things that technician skill and really well-maintained, calibrated machines can account for. Like, we can get beautiful playback of really challenging material through calibration and through adjusting levels and adjusting the alignment of the tape heads and things like that. And I'm not saying that every single cassette out there needs the white glove treatment in this way, but it's your content and it's valuable. So it's important to be aware that these are some of the issues that are common when you're playing back analog media. I see a lot of questions coming through the chat, so I'm trying to. Okay, sources for cassette decks. I wish I knew. I'm going to give you another reality check here. I bought some cassette decks from a friend of mine who had a studio, and I was like, cool, I'm just going to run them over to my tech to get them all like fixed up and then put them in my studio. And the wait list was 18 months. So finding a technician who can do the work to get these in good working order is incredibly difficult. It's costly and it takes a long time. Reverb.com is a pretty good source for finding legacy machines in good working condition. You can often get them from studios that are, where they're no longer in use, and hopefully they've been like well maintained over the years in that. So I go to Reverb, not so much eBay these days, although in the past eBay has been a good source. Let's see. There's some good advice here in the chat, so follow along if you're looking for it. Here you go. So sometimes this stuff goes really well. Sometimes you just hit play and it plays back and it's beautiful and everything is great and you kick back and listen to it and have a great time. Here are some things that can go wrong. And again, this is just sort of, it's not like a scare tactic, it's just like a reality check so that you can be aware that this is the stuff that happens when you digitize hundreds of cassettes. They get sticky. Cassettes also sometimes need to be baked. They break often and need to be spliced back together, or sometimes, as in this picture, you have to pull out the little spools of tape and put them in a new cassette housing in order to get them to play back. The little felt pad that presses the tape against your tape head, that gets worn or kind of disintegrates, and then you have to replace that. As we already talked about, DATs can be really finicky about which playback deck they will play back in. Sometimes CDRs work better when you rip them faster or slower. And how do you know which one it's going to be? You don't, you just have to try it. But again, like the big picture here is if you've got a large collection and not a lot of resources, do the easy ones. Triage the ones that are more difficult and you can deal with them later. You can flag them to send out to an expert, or you can find a safety copy that works and then not become so burdened by the ones that are causing problems for you.
Well, I love this because people are starting to answer other people's questions in the chat. So
I love it.
Read the chat. There was one about baking open reels from James Moody, who wanted to know that he's heard that you can only play it back once. And he wanted to know if that was true after you bake it. And Jeff Walker, thank you, Jeff. He said, depending on the deterioration of the tape, yes, sometimes you only get one playback off a tape.
Sometimes you only get one. Sometimes it's, as I think someone else said earlier, baking is really not as scary as it sometimes seems. It's a pretty common and straightforward thing. And sometimes, you bake it and you play it back and things are great. Those are great days when that happens. But especially when that tape is the only recording of something that is very valuable to you, yeah, you do want to be extraordinarily careful not to destroy the physical item before you get the audio off of it. Let's see. Yes, and thank you, Flan, you're right about that. Please follow along in the chat, everyone. I'm trying to like follow the chat myself, but it's hard to keep track of all of the great conversations that are going on. And I'm almost done with this section, so we'll be handing off to Nikki pretty shortly to talk about some more fun stuff. I was going to play some audio for you for this, but I think audio is really hard to perceive over Zoom. So I give you a visual instead, and this is just, you know, a visual of the difference between an archival quality 96K 24-bit WAV file and a pretty lousy MP3. So for those of you who are not familiar with a spectral rendering of an audio file, it's just a different way of visualizing the audio. And in this case, on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have frequency, which you cannot tell because this picture is very, very small, but it goes way up to like 30K. And then the orangey or yellowiness is sort of the intensity of it. And on the left, we have a full fidelity waveform that would be archival quality. And on the right, a lossy MP3. And you can see that when you create an MP3 out of something, like not only do you lose basically all of your audio content above 20 kilohertz, but you lose lots of chunks of information throughout. And that's in order to give you a smaller file size, right? Just wanted to give you a visual of this so you can kind of see what you will hear if you do this experiment on your own at home. This is basically why we don't archive as MP3s. We'll talk briefly about a workflow, and then we'll take another nice pause for some more questions. So with a workflow, again, we're kind of reaching back to the very beginning here. You got to take a moment and figure out what you've got, where it is, right? Do you have a few items, or do you have thousands of items? Do you have some of the gear you might need to digitize and reformat this media, or do you have none of it? Do you have time? Do you have money? Do you have resources? I will paraphrase Wesley and the Princess Bride here. You gotta figure out your assets and your liabilities, and your workflow will depend on that. Once you kind of figure out how much time, money, resources, and stuff you're dealing with, you can organize. You can choose to do the high priority items first. You can do the easy items first, and you can do those in-house. You can make a decision to outsource bulk items. If you have 4,000 cassettes, that's probably a good indicator that you do need to go to an outside vendor who can do them very, very quickly and in bulk. You can send out the challenging items. You can make decisions about whether you want to digitize things one at a time, if you need to listen to the recording as you digitize, or if you want to set up 4 cassette decks, hit play 4 times, and spot check them as they go in. Is this going to be something that you need to do as one major project where you devote a bunch of time to it and get it done? Or is this going to be an ongoing thing where every day or every week you do a couple of items? These are the questions that help you develop a workflow that's going to align with your resources, with your time. And if I were a visual person, I'm an audio person, so I can't do the visuals. If I were a visual person, I would make you a beautiful flow chart here, like an infographic that would help you make these decisions and come to a workflow that's going to work for you. But what I wanted to do is just pose these questions to you so you can think about things like, do I do this in-house? Do I outsource, or a combination? Do I do this a little bit at a time, or are we going to write a grant and spend 1 year doing everything? Those are the kind of questions that I ask folks when we start a project like this. So in terms of project planning, I always love to throw out these reality checks. There's no way around this. This work takes a lot of time, and it costs a lot of money. And the gear required to digitize all of these different analog and early digital tangible media formats, that stuff costs so much money. For example, each of these cassettes, this is a set I did for the Kitchen Sisters, might contain up to 2 hours of content. So you can do the math there at how long it took me to digitize those cassettes and document in the spreadsheet all of the data around that, and create broadcast WAV files for preservation and MP3s and photograph all of the items. This stuff is very time consuming, and it does require an investment in personnel, in gear, and in time. So now that I've made this really fun, let's take another moment to share some resources and answer and ask some questions. For best practices, I will immediately point you to IASA TC04 and the ARS Guide to Audio Preservation and the Library of Congress. Those are the organizations that have brilliant people working through this and coming up with standards and best practices. So we don't have to make this stuff up. Just go to the guides and do what they tell you. No joke. And then for vendors, I threw a couple of names out there. These are folks that I know through my work or have worked with, and there are many more, but I would, very happily endorse sending your materials to any of these folks. So another time. Oh, look, we have a Bayback person here. Thank you, Victoria. Let's see.
So there's a question about BWF equals wave ?
Yes, it's a broadcast wave. It is a wave file. They're basically the same. BWFs, you can have more info in the header, so you can it's sort of like getting into the programming side of things. It can store more data. And Anna Frick, I just see a shout out to Anna Frick, and I have to say, she and I are friends and she's awesome. So Airshow Mastering, for sure, she does great restoration work.
There's a question about recycling older cassettes that you don't want to save. How do you do that and where? And also CDs, I'm interested in that issue.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. I actually don't know about recycling that media. The only thing I've used CDs for is to scare birds away from butterflies. Or gardening.
Okay, great. I knew someone would know. Thank you, Diane.
But does anyone know where you can recycle some of this media? That's a good question for the group.
So Victoria came up with, yeah.
Oh, we can use the tape for building.
911 digital media, so recycling. That's good.
Oh, great. Thank you. Any other questions about, this was a lot to digest, and I recognize that, and I feel like any one of these could, we could branch off and do a whole workshop on any one of these topics. So I just want to make sure that the info we're sharing is like we're hitting our targets here. So if you do have other questions, by all means, like throw them in the chat and we'll try to keep track of things. I have just a little bit more to share before handing off to talk about the joy of creating with archival content. But man, I feel like I'm being such a Debbie Downer here, but here I am with another reality check that even once you have gone through all of the work and you have a glorious spreadsheet and you've digitized things and you have WAV files, you still got to maintain this stuff. So the work is ongoing, and your newly digitized collection will need to be maintained, and periodically migrated to new hard drives, and there's no getting around that. So here I'm just going to share, again, a few best practices and strategies for backing up your data, for monitoring data integrity. We'll talk a little bit about long-term storage of the physical media, and then really the important thing is here, how to build it into your workflow, how to just make it part of your weekly tasks, right? So the backup rule of thumb, you can always do better than this, but at minimum, you should have 3 copies of your data on 2 separate hard drives in different locations, plus 1 in the cloud. And in practice, that may mean you keep a hard drive at the office and 1 at home. If you are working on a server like a Synology NAS, you can have a NAS buddy where you back up each other's data. So 1 in your home or studio and 1 somewhere across the country. There are so many cloud service options these days, and I can't tell you which one you should use, but I can tell you that I use Backblaze, which is a wonderful catastrophic backup system. And hopefully, if it works well, I never have to actually use them. I just pay them every month for a cloud backup of all my data. Here's your, I'm just like really coming at it with the reality checks today. Your hard drives will die. They all have a lifespan. I pulled up from Backblaze the quarterly failure rates for quarter 3 of 2021. And you can just get a sense, like they've got tens of thousands of drives in action through Backblaze, and you can see the percentage that die. They tend to die. There's like a little curve here. After 5 years, the likelihood that they will die tends to go up. So I migrate from hard drives every 4 or 5 years, if not sooner. Also, your files may become corrupt. So you have to maintain the, not just the backups, but monitor the data integrity. And there are ways to do that. I'm going to throw out the term checksums. I don't know how familiar most of you are with that, but it's just a code that tells you your ones and zeros are where they should be. And when you run a checksum on a file, it can say, yes, the ones and zeros are all in alignment, or no, something's off. Can't fix it, but it can tell you that something's wrong, so you could go to a backup copy. Here's a little bit more on that. For creating checksums, I can recommend the tool MD5er, which Jesse from the Library of Congress, who's helping with the Kitchen Sisters program, turned me onto. And also a program from We Are AVP called Fixity that just can monitor the checksums on your hard drives. And again, flag anything that shows up as a potentially corrupt file. So just something to work into a best practice, just something that you kind of can use weekly to keep track of the data on all of your hard drives. Here's my other tip though, just put it in your calendar. I know how hard it is to make time for this. I literally put it in my calendar. I put it in for today. So today at 2 o'clock, I'm gonna back up my hard drive. If you block off time daily or weekly, it just becomes part of your workflow, and then you get into the habit of it. And then yes, you have your hard drives backed up in 2 locations, and you can put your stuff in the cloud. I'm going through this quickly so we can get to more fun stuff. For physical storage, this is again a little outside my wheelhouse because I tend to do more of the digitizing, but I use acid-free boxes. We purchase them at a place called Gaylord. You should always store your stuff somewhere that's stable, not too hot, not too cold, not too humid, away from the light, from radiators, from magnetic material, from pests. This all seems fairly straightforward, but I know in practice it can be really difficult to find such a space. A tip I got in the Bay Area, although this probably applies many places, that you can look for wine storage or fine art storage. And those can be good places to store your audiovisual materials long term. Again, the Library of Congress has great resources for this. You could also call up the folks at Iron Mountain. They are the total pros in this area. So here's my list of resources for you around maintenance, some places for supplies for boxes and things like that. Library of Congress always has great resources. Iron Mountain. Here's some options for cloud storage or catastrophic backup plans. You can investigate these on your own and figure out what's going to work best for you. But of course, it is a good idea to have your stuff in the cloud. Although, remember the cloud is really just a bunch of hard drives, and they eventually will crash too. I don't want to leave on a downer note. Let's take a moment for some more questions, and then I'm going to hand off to Nikki.
So James wants to know, are solid state drives safer than magnetic hard drives?
That's a really good question. And I have been investigating this myself. And I don't have a solid answer about whether the hard drives should spin or be solid state. Is there someone else in our crowd here who might have a good answer for that?
And then Bob wants to know, any advantage in using SSD drives? Is that solid state?
Yeah, solid state.
Okay, that's, sorry,
Oh,
abbreviation. Okay,
Totally.
and about FLAC and ALAC formats.
Oh, yes. Okay, so I see that Cody dropped a link from Backblaze on solid state SSD versus HDD reliability. So that's probably a good link to follow through. I think, we can all educate ourselves on that. Right now I have a spinning drive and as my work drive, and it's kind of annoying because it gets a little noisy, but I do have solid state drives in my NAS. And that's just me in practice. I tend to spread the wealth here, so I have a little bit of both. Let's see. FLAC files. Actually, I heard a really great presentation about FLAC versus WAV files at ARSC a couple of years ago. That's another organization for audio preservation. And this was very much in favor of using FLAC as a smaller file size that is still lossless. So although I am not using it myself, I think FLAC is probably a perfectly fine format to use. It's also, I think it's more of an open source format. Software to mirror hard drives. Man, I used one a long time ago called Synchronize X, and I'm not sure if that one is like completely obsolete by now. Does anyone else have a good resource for software that can mirror hard drives? Synchronize X was the one I used, but I'm not using that currently.
Let's talk about the Internet Archive.
Yes, please do. Talk about the Internet Archive.
Yes, people are asking, has anyone worked with the Internet Archive as an option for public use archive? And yes, we have. And they're great. They're saving it all.
There's some really great, I'm following the chat here, there's some really great resources for, yes, Carbon Copy Cloner, DropSync 3, some more information on FLAC. So please follow along in the chat for lots more info. I'm so glad we have like a really brilliant group of people here contributing to this. We can make these resources available after this workshop to share. And I just want to kind of recontextualize again. These are not exhaustive. These are resources that I used in working with the Kitchen Sisters and in some of my other projects, and resources that I turn to frequently when I feel like I'm out of my skill set or out of my area. So because so many of us are working independently these days, we have to be our own archivists and our own catalogers and our own IT departments. And it's a lot to take on. We can't be experts in all of this. So all of this is very much about doing the best you can with the resources that you have and the time you have. And that's why I'm giving you a lot of, I'm pointing you to a lot of places where there are experts doing this work. So you can find out what other people are doing and then figure out how to apply it to your own projects. All right. This is going to be a lot more fun. I'm going to hand off to Nikki now to talk about what you can do with your content and how you can share your newly organized, beautifully digitized audio, how you can find some value in your collection and repurpose things. And Nikki, can I hand off to you?
Sure. And Nathan too. Nathan, you're out there and you're going to help talk a little bit about social media, because I think that's one of the great things that, finding some of these wonderful tidbits in your old archive. It's a great way to get things out there. But I think probably for us, a lot of what we've been doing with this material that we've been finding and uncovering and unearthing, it's always been there. We just couldn't remember it or didn't have access to it easily, is the podcast. And it's been absolutely wonderful to do that for us, because, most of the stuff that we did in the early days, 5 and 6 and 7 minute stories for NPR. And for each of those stories, there's 50 hours of material that we had gathered and collected, both archival material from other sources as well as interviews, 20 and 30 interviews to do a 5-minute piece. And all of that is neatly stored away, but we've been, like, I think all of you out there, you keep moving forward and don't often look back at what you have. So it's been great to see some of this stuff emerge. Like one of the things that emerged was the second interview that Davy and I ever did together back in 1979. We'd always told this story, but in some ways I think we thought we were making it up or exaggerating or something. But then we finally unearthed the tape that proved that this had actually happened. We went to interview these two lumber guys, a father and son team in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We went there at 10 o'clock at night. We didn't know what we were doing. This was like our second interview that we'd ever done together. And we had all these questions to ask these guys about, the history of logging. And we were doing sort of an oral history of the region and these early kinds of work that were dying. And these guys just seemed so uninterested in answering any of these questions. And all they wanted to talk about, well, at first, the thing that led us into the whole discussion was the father finally said, "Stevie, show the girls the snake." And I thought the snakes, I thought we maybe made that up, but we didn't. It's there on the tape. They took us into this back room where they had 36 rattlers. And they had this whole thing where they were taming and training rattlesnakes. They would put little Velcro on their backs and have them pull Conestoga wagons, and they would dress them in senorita gowns and have them dangling from trapezes, and they would take them out to Rotary Club meetings and to all kinds of functions locally. How I never heard of this, I don't know. Anyway, we found this tape, and at the very end of the tape, you hear Davia say in this kind of mesmerized voice, "Can we touch the rattlers?" And I mean, that's one of the stories you sort of elaborate on in later years, but there it was, the proof. So I say there's a gold mine in those tapes that you haven't heard for 40 years. And this is one thing I'm hoping people will save their tapes to go back and listen and use for your own stories, but also to make them available to others. And I think doing that through your website or, people have to have a way to find these things. And I say, if you do have a website, to list your recordings and to do some metadata about what's on it or who's talking on it. I mean, if you're interested in sharing. And I think that that's what this is all about, is kind of sharing these resources so that the next generation of documentarians have access to do stories that are true and can keep us kind of heading in the right direction. Another thing I was mentioning was social media. Nathan, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of our radio series that is about archiving is called The Keepers. You see it there at the top of the list there. And so, what we were doing stories about what we say, archivists, activist archivists, rogue librarians, keepers of the culture. And we had so much material. We had so many archives, so many different collections that we wanted to cover. So we came up with this idea called Keeper of the Day. So when the series launched, we not only did stories for NPR, for the Kitchen Sisters Present podcast, we also started doing a series for social media called Keeper of the Day. And we worked with a local design agency to come up with a look and a feel. And we created what Davey Nikki called kind of like baseball cards. They're digital baseball cards. They all had the kind of same look, the same feel, we used the same font. We had developed a logo, and over every day for about a year, we'd create these new keepers of the day. And it was a great way for us not to just share the stories we were working on, but also to share little tidbits of, audio that we'd found in archives, little tidbits of visual, photographs of art, of different things like that that we'd come across over the course of our research. And it was also a great way because we asked people around the country to share some of their favorite archives with us, some of their favorite collections with us. So it was a way to involve, you know, hundreds, thousands of different people across the country, across the globe in this project. And it kind of took on a life of its own. You know, we would share it every day on you know, the main social media channels and also on our website. And then every quarter or so, we put them together on our and sent what we call the Keeper Quarterly to our email list. So it would, you know, we would send out 90 or so, you know, baseball cards, these Keeper of the Day cards to our mailing list. So it was just a really fun way to use a lot of this archival audio that we were collecting.
Do we have, I think we have a picture of that, an image that shows some of those, don't we? I thought we did. Yeah, here they are. And that's another thing, just in this doesn't, a lot of our collection are graphics that we've collected. And I urge everybody to be collecting visuals in everything that they do. And it really helps with the social media, and also just kind of being able to push these audio stories into other mediums. And YouTube, do projects on YouTube, any way to get these stories out there. We're always interested in trying new ways. So there's a lot of things going on in the chat here. Any questions about materials? You know, one of the things that's really interesting to us and important to us is that the earliest stories that Davia and I ever did were based on material that we had gotten from the Library of Congress. When we first got started, we were doing a lot of historical programs and stories about World War II and the home front. And we went to the Library of Congress and just plugged in our machines. That's what you could do at that time. We put our cassette player, plugged it into their machine, and we were able to take all of these old commercials and early recordings and you know, news reports and speeches by Franklin Roosevelt, on and on. And it so enriched our stories. It just became this way we have continued to go through producing with all of this archival material. And it's really important to us that the stuff that people have given us permission to use over these years, who have really entrusted to us, that it's going to the Library of Congress so that future generations of documentarians can use this material in the same way that we used the earlier material we got from the Library of Congress and the National Archives as well.
I want to chime in that as someone who had the incredible pleasure of listening to the full interviews, this content is a masterclass in conducting interviews and in producing a very coherent and beautifully realized story from hours and hours of content. Because listening to the way that Nikki and Davia will engage in conversation with someone and draw out the stories, it's just been a really fascinating thing for me as someone who got my start in radio many years ago, to hear what clips from an hour-long interview actually make it into a produced piece, and to understand how they pulled out these threads of a story from hours and hours of recording. And not just interviews, but one of my favorite things that you record is the radio or television, or just walking around and hearing street ambience. And those are documents of the sound of a world that no longer exists except in this collection. So I feel like it's been just a very cool thing for me to hear a produced piece and then hear all of the raw content and figure out, try to get into your minds and think about how you tell that story.
I'm reading here.
I did want to ask you a little bit about recontextualizing, though, because I was poking around on the blog, and I just saw this one that it's from last year, but I thought it was really fascinating to connect current events with a story that you had previously reported to give a new understanding to this story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this was a piece that we produced for our Hidden Kitchen series, and it the birth of Rice-A-Roni. I just love this idea that the birth of Rice-A-Roni could hold such an amazingly rich and intense and moving story. So this we produced for NPR, a 6-minute piece. And in that 6-minute piece, we told the story of a woman from Canada who comes to San Francisco during World War II. She marries her husband, who is part of the Golden Grain macaroni empire, hence in the Italian family in San Francisco. It's during wartime, so they can't find a place to live because there's a housing shortage. And they move in with this Armenian woman, Palazzo Kaptanian. And Palazzo Kaptanian teaches this woman that we interviewed, Lois De Domenico, how to cook. And they're making yogurt in the kitchen, and they're making all kinds of traditional dishes. And she teaches her how to make rice pilaf, which becomes a family favorite. So during their visits in the kitchen, Mrs. Kaptanian tells Lois about this book that she wrote in 1919 about her escape from the Armenian genocide. And it's one of the only books that's ever been written as a first-person account that was written so close after it happened. And Lois had lost touch with Mrs. Kaptanian, just had this vague memory of it all. But as she told the story, we went on the hunt for Mrs. Kaptanian, and we found her grandson. And her grandson knew of the book but didn't have access to it. We found a librarian in France who had translated the book and did an interview with her. Now, all of this is going into a 6-minute piece. And of course, then we have to tell the story of the Armenian genocide and the escape, and the fact that she leaves her children with another family and has to walk for months through the desert. I mean, this is all in the midst of a Rice-A-Roni story. And at the end, we have to get back to Rice-A-Roni, right? Because that's the subject of the piece. So Lois continues to cook rice pilaf, and one night her brother-in-law says, "This would be good in a box." So that's kind of the birth of Rice-A-Roni. But what happened to the other story in all of that? It got diminished to 2 minutes, if that. So the podcast has really been this way to put it out there, put all of this incredible story, and the twists and the turns and the side roads, all of the things that kind of so compelled us from the very start. It's this way to push it out there. So, I mean, I feel like this raw material that Jessica has been lovingly taking care of and getting us access to has such importance in terms of the historical record. And I just can't urge people enough, no matter what your resources, no matter how much time you have or don't have time to do this, I just urge everyone to begin. Just begin, make a list, figure out some sort of a numbering system and just be consistent and do it as you can do it. But I'm so grateful to Jessica for helping us out with all of this, because it's made a profound difference in our work.
Thank you. It's really been such an honor and a privilege to hear these recordings. And I do want to encourage you all to check out the podcast, because it is a way to expand on things and follow some of these story threads that didn't make it into the original productions. I think that's really where you start to hear the value of these archival recordings, when you have the time and the space to go deep with them.
The other thing is, if you do have a podcast, I urge you to put a transcript of the podcast on your website. If you have it available through your website, a transcript will make it searchable, and people will be able to find it. I think that's one of the most exciting things about what's going on with all of these applications for transcribing, you know, Descript, and you can so easily transcribe things now. And that's what has kept audio locked in the closet in so many institutions, because people couldn't search it. They had to listen in real time, and that really held back that kind of research. But now there is that opportunity. So things just keep progressing in a great way for this historical audio.
But that was a good reminder that it's about digitizing the audio and making it accessible and having all of this information around it so you can search for it. So it's not just a WAV file on a hard drive, but there's some context and some information about what's actually within that WAV file. And we did that with the Kitchen Sisters collection. We came up with a few basic things for just almost like tagging a WAV file. Like this one had some ambience, this one had an interview, just some basic, again, sort of standardized terms, but a way for us to sort them and you know, document how many times you recorded like radio or street sounds, or I remember Davia telling me, listen for sprinklers. I think there was a phase that you where you were recording sprinklers. Is that right?
I love sprinklers.
But those are incredible, like,
and
sounds
birds
that,
and yeah, birds and ambient sound. And I mean, it's a great way when you're producing to make a transition in your story, to have a door shut. And if you know how to find that door slam, that will make your job a lot easier. So I always, we try to, if we record ambience on the tape, you say, you know, recording door slam now, or gate is closing, or birds are chirping, great birds here, sprinklers are sprinkling. And that really does help you find things that you might need to produce a story.
looks like we have a question about permissions and transcriptions. Nikki, do you want to talk about Descript a little bit?
Well, Descript is just this application that we've been using, and you drag your audio into it, and honestly, within like less than 2 minutes, there's a pretty good transcription there. But the other great thing about it is that you can actually hear the audio as you read the script. You know, with your cursor, you can follow along. And there's a way, which I've never used, but there's a way you can actually cut the audio, and like a cut and paste thing you do with a Word document. You can do that same thing with Descript. You can cut and paste the words, and it will do it to the audio. And then you can output it as in various ways. And it's life-changing, really. When I look back at this stuff, we're finding these transcripts where, you know, Davia and I are transcribing by hand in 1980, you know, on this funky typing paper that's probably going to disintegrate any minute. And I think about how many hours we spent doing that. It's very much a game changer.
So that's Descript, a really valuable tool for transcription. I see some questions in the chat about ownership and copyright issues, and that for sure is outside my area of expertise. You know, the first thing I would say is consult a lawyer, but beyond that, what are some useful things we can share about ownership and copyright in archival audio materials?
Well, it's such a tricky question, and we do have permissions for our interviews, a lot of them. Some of them we don't, and so we're including caveats, you know, just yes, we have permission, no, we don't have permission. Those kinds of things are going throughout the collection. It's a big job, and you know, it's a work in progress. We're still working on a lot of the details with the Library of Congress about how it's all going to be handled. We are going to, for the first, I think it's several years, maintain some sort of overview over the material, so that depending on how it's used, we will have a say in terms of you know, how people use it. And then it'll be the library's job to do that at some point when we're gone. So.
Another good question, how do you document interview permissions? Do you have written ones or do you get a verbal consent?
Both. We've tried, especially when we sort of start out a new series or something, we go, okay, we need permissions, and we develop a permissions sheet that's special just for that series, and we ask people to sign. And those permissions have changed over the years because, you know, when we started out, there were no computers that we had access to. There were no blogs. There was no online. When we did the book that we wrote, we went back and actually got permissions from the people that we were going to be including in the book. And we do ask people at the end of interviews, do we have your permission to use this? And we sometimes don't ask that. And yeah, so it's a mixed bag.
And I'll add that in the digitizing process, I documented just in a column in our spreadsheet if something had a copyright or not. And obviously most of the interviews, good to go, but you had many recordings of commercially released music, or you would have recordings of like a film or a television broadcast. It just gets a little check from me. This is, I think, one of those areas where it's like, as much as we want to be an expert in all aspects of this, we can't be an expert in all of it. So the best that I felt we could do was say, yes, there's a copyright thing with this one, so be aware of that. And no, this one is all interviews and field recordings. So just something, you know, something as simple as like a yes or no at least gives you something to work with when you may need to consult with a lawyer or a legal team if you're going to be producing something with it or sending it off to a university archive or something like that. I do see some other really good comments around transcription options. So please follow along in the chat and we will try to gather these all and create a document that we can share. Let's see, do we keep all the raw audio as well as the editing sessions? Yep.
Yes, we keep everything. And actually we're keeping digitized copies of all of the things that we give to them as well, because we're continuing to produce and do stories. So yeah, I think we've kept everything. That's been the reality of all of this, and that's why we're so grateful that it is actually going to be cared for and taken to the next level of access for people. Jessica, can you talk about the Internet Archive a little bit?
I can. I want to make one point real quickly because I think we haven't said it out loud, but I think it's really worth highlighting. Archiving is not contradictory with continuing to produce from archival content. So you can work on preserving your stuff and you can send it off to a university or to some place like the Library of Congress and maintain your rights to the content and maintain, you know, to like work out the details. I'm not being the lawyer here, but maintain your ability to continue to produce from it. So it's, you know, it's just important to remember that like preserving your work doesn't mean it goes on the shelf and you close that door. If anything, it opens other doors for you to continue to produce from it. The Internet Archive. So I've done some work with the Internet Archive as well. And I have to say they're like a fabulous group of people and very forward thinking and have done a lot of work around issues with copyright and access. I can't go down that pathway because again, it's kind of outside my area of expertise, but they do allow anyone to upload content that you are the rights holder for. And to that end, they can be, you know, a sort of, I'm not going to call it a repository because I feel like I'm stepping on the toes of archives there, but they can be a place for you to park content in order to share it. And I know a lot of podcasters will upload their content to the Internet Archive and then it lives there and it's searchable and it's accessible and maintained. I don't know the long-term, I don't know sort of any of the long-term legalities or guarantees with the Internet Archive, but certainly it's a very practical and easy to implement way of putting your content in a place where it can be easily accessed.
One of the first ways that we had some of our work digitized was with the, help me with the title here, the California Audio Visual Preservation Project. And they had put out a request saying, if you have old tapes and things that you think are important to preserve, send us an application letter and describe them, and we'll see, and maybe we will digitize them for you. So we put in an application for 50 of them, and we were selected, and they did them. And one of the caveats was that these tapes would then go onto the Internet Archive. And, you know, I thought about that. One of the people that we interviewed, one of the first people we ever interviewed, was this old cowboy who had worked on a dairy ranch that's now a state park in Wilder Ranch. And we interviewed him like probably 40 times, and had he was very crotchety, wonderful. We were both in love with him. And all these tapes, which we actually had never really produced as a story. It was when we were just getting started, and these tapes went up on the Internet Archive. And I got a letter from the head of the docent training at Wilder Ranch saying how thrilled they were to have access to this man's voice. He had worked on that farm since 1919, and none of the docents, of course, had ever had a chance to talk to him about what things were really like. So that's the kind of thing that the Internet Archive can help with. I mean, when people search, they will find interviews that are there.
I see another good comment in the chat. It's true, repositories and universities and so many places are just as strapped for resources as many of us are. So donating your collection is not necessarily a guarantee that it will be digitized in a timely manner or at all. And, you know, that's just the reality of what we're dealing with. You know, you can Google the numbers, but the numbers of tapes that have not been digitized are astounding, and I won't say insurmountable, but yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. So if you are considering placing your collection within an institution, just keep that in mind. You may want to invest in doing some of the digitizing yourselves ahead of time. You may want to find out what the plan is if it does wind up in an institution. And at the same time, we all know how valuable this stuff is. We hear it and we produce it and we work with it. So, you know, acknowledge and recognize that value. And through the documenting process and the digitization process, you can really uncover that value.
I truly think too that the fact that things are much easier to transcribe now is going to make a difference in terms of institutions accepting audio, because I think it was sort of a black hole for a lot of institutions to think, oh, we're going to have all these tapes and no one to transcribe them. And but I think that this will make a big difference. And also, if you do work relating to a region, like we've given so much of our material to special collections at UCSC, to the Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz, you know, stories like the CZU lightning complex fires, the interviews we did for that, they're all in these various local institutions, as well as the recordings that we did after the 1989 earthquake, Loma Prieta earthquake, like really trying to find the institution where it wants to live and who's going to take a particular interest in what you've done, I think is definitely worth searching and finding out who in your area might want it.
That's a really good point. We did talk a little bit about the Internet Archive. YouTube and SoundCloud are other options for sharing. Does anyone else in the Zoom want to comment on places to park your stuff to make it accessible? Any other places that we're not thinking of here? We can talk a little bit about the grant writing process. I will say that absolutely crucial in even being able to write a grant was that first hurdle of getting the inventory. You know, no one's going to give you money if you're like, well, we've got some stuff, we're not sure what it is. So having an inventory and being able to say, like, we have 3,287 cassettes, that's, you know, with the grant readers, that's the kind of stuff they want to know. Oh, Bandcamp, that's another great one for musical options.
That's great. That's great. I'm loving reading this chat. It's great.
I pulled up this SoundCloud picture because Route 66 was another collection I digitized, and that one was total time travel because I got to hear all of the raw tapes and all of the interviews you did on this journey, and I felt like I was in the car along with you for that. Yes, Brandy commented there are planning and implementation grants, so if you're feeling overwhelmed by that first hurdle, that is another option to get some funding in order to start the process of creating an inventory. And thank you, Kitty. Hi, Kitty. The Grammy Museum has a wonderful grants program that has helped the Kitchen Sisters and other local organizations. The Our Hooli Foundation and the Freight and Salvage have also been recipients of some funding from those grants.
And that's how we met Jessica, was really when we applied for the Grammy grant. So
they
good
do
things
wonderful
come from,
work.
like I said, good things come from applying for these grants. Even if you don't get them, it will help you to really organize your thoughts and figure out what you need.
You're right. It's a really good opportunity to kind of gives you a timeline and a deadline for organizing your thoughts around your own project. And yes, a good comment. A lot of these places, you know, it's not a guarantee that these, especially anything that's essentially a for-profit company, they may not stick around. So it is not secure long-term storage. It's maybe a place for access right now, but not a long-term guarantee. We get so much, there's such a wealth of information among this group. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us and for contributing. I'm throwing up the thank you slides because I have a lot of people that I would love to thank, but mostly, you know, Nikki and Davia and
well,
Brandy.
definitely the National Endowment for the Humanities. Really, they've made so much possible and continue to support artists and institutions and humanists. So thank you for this. And Jessica, can't thank you enough. And Brandy Howell, who has really shepherded this collection with such love and care. Thank you, Brandy, for all of your work on this collection, and Nathan and so many more. And thank you. I mean, I'm seeing all these experts out there like Addie and Flawn and so many people who know so much. And thank you for zooming in and taking part and sharing all of what you are up to and what you know. It's been great.
Yeah. So grateful for the wealth of information that folks are sharing here, and a good reminder that this is such a team effort. No one could have done this on their own. We really needed to work together and collaborate on every step of the way.
I think collaboration is the key, or it's the queen, you know, collaborating. It's how it works. It's the only way it can work. So I urge you all to find some collaborators.
For sure. Do we have any other, I feel like we're trolling both for questions and resources. So if you have questions, toss them in the chat and we can see how much we can get in before we wrap up. And if you have resources, we are collecting them and we can share them with everyone.
And hopefully, you know, there will be more of these workshops in the future. There's like so many experts on this call that we could pursue this.
For
Just gonna type in the, sorry, feedback. We will be sending out the some resources and also the video of this presentation. So and also post it on social media and our website, so it'll be accessible.
And for grants, we should come up with a list of grant resources. I know we've already mentioned the Grammy Museum grants program. CLIR, C-L-I-R, has a grants program. The NEDCC has a grants program. I know there are local arts organizations that you might connect with state by state. Who has other ideas? NEH, NEA, who has other ideas for grants?
Ours.
ARSC, yep, ARSC has a grants program as well. Thank you, Summer.
Jessica, do you know if the California Audiovisual Preservation Project is still doing that project? That
I
was
don't know.
that
We'll
was
have to
pretty
look it
amazing.
up. Yeah, we'll have to look it up. I think it's always fascinating to see how these things align, and sometimes, you know, a larger organization like the NEH is the right place to look, and sometimes it's something much more local or more specific to your content. So that's another thing to just be aware of through this process.
I think another thing too, partnering with local museums and libraries and special collections. We've done a lot of, like with the CZU interviews, Lightning Fire interviews, we partnered to do an exhibit where we used, you know, clips from the interviews that we've done throughout the exhibit. And I mean, there's so many ways to partner and possibly get some funding for what it is you want to do.
Well, again, I hope the big takeaway here is that we have a lot of resources and we hope to share them. And most importantly, I hope you all feel inspired to just get started, whatever those first steps are. Getting started will, you know, set you on the pathway. So thanks again for coming and spending some time with us today and for sharing so much valuable info in the chat. And we hope to see you all at a future workshop or someday in person.